Well, this week, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to take up a long-running dispute regarding the overcrowding of California's prison system. California Governor Jerry Brown had asked the court to overturn a 2011 judicial order that required the state to reduce the prison population by nearly 140%. California prisons have been in the national spotlight over the course of the past year as the state grappled with the severe overcrowding, leading to concerns about the prison's health conditions. One particular concern for prison advocates has been the state's employment of a long-term solitary confinement policy, a controversy which led to a major hunger strike by California prisoners earlier this year. Now, of the roughly 120,000 inmates in California prisons, the court has ordered that the state free about 9,600 additional inmates by the end of the year. California has already cut its prison population by about 25,000 inmates in the past 2 years. So to discuss this and the mass incarceration that seems to define this country, I'm joined by Eugene Puryear, author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America.
Thank you so much for having me, Ameera.
So happy to have you on. When it comes to California, can you talk about the conditions that these prison inmates have been living under and why the court ordered the release of so many of them?
Well, you know, it's an absolutely terrible situation. I mean, we saw that around when the first court ruling came from the Supreme Court, almost 180% overcapacity California prisons were. And if you look at the pictures of it, it's people stacked up on bunks and gymnasiums, stuck anywhere and everywhere. And many of these people are non-violent offenders in prison for things like simple possession. We also see in states like California, as you mentioned in your opening, the very harsh use of solitary confinement. In 2011, the Council of Europe said that anything more than 15 days in solitary confinement should be considered injurious. In Pelican Bay State Prison, where the hunger strike first started, there's over 500 people who spent over 10 years in solitary confinement. And not to mention, California, at the beginning part of this decade, was only spending about $2 a day on food for prisoners. And the average person in America spends about $8 a day per food. So they were overcrowded, kept in isolation cells in large amount, and really in just overall terrible conditions.
Oh, it's tragic. What do you make of the argument being made by municipalities and, of course, by Governor Jerry Brown that the influx of these inmates being released is going to be very burdensome, it's going to be dangerous?
I think it's really just an obfuscation of the issue. I mean, I think we know that the court order, and many people know that the court order ordered that only low-level nonviolent offenders be released. So it's not as if murderers or rapists are just being thrown out onto the street. And I think California, which is a state when if you disaggregate it from the United States as a whole, is about the 5th largest economy in the world. It has a tremendous amount of resources and other things. So really, instead of complaining about all the problems this is going to create, I think this creates a great new opportunity for politicians instead to talk about how do we reinvest in our cities, particularly the so-called inner cities, invest in education and infrastructure and job training. And in a rich, wealthy state like California, that's a possibility. But instead, the politicians are pandering to those who push these mass incarceration policies like the prison guard unions, perhaps even private prison industries, and all those other people who look to only throwing more people in prison to solve the social problems of our country, not attacking them at their root.
Sure. And, you know, the idea that these prisoners are just being freed is not necessarily the case. I know that there are plans to move some of these prisoners to, you know, state prisons, local prisons, private prisons. So in a way, is this perhaps not solving the problem, but just shifting it?
I think to a certain degree it's significantly shifting it. I mean, it's really only dealing principally with the issue of overcrowding, not the sort of underlying principles of why these people are in prison in the first place. And thankfully, the people of California, recently in September, State Bill 649 passed. 75% of people in California support some of the reforms that this bill was pushing forward, which will allow for lesser sentences for people who are convicted of low-level nonviolent offenses. And that's what's really driving this. And I think ultimately shifting people to local jails and certainly to private prisons is only really evading the issue and not really getting to the point of why are we putting so many people in prison, and is there another way to deal with these issues that afflict our communities?
Absolutely, a very, very important question to be asking. Well, earlier this year there was a mass hunger strike, as I mentioned, in the California prison system. Was it in response to the conditions that spurred basically all of these lawsuits? And do you know if any of those conditions were met?
Certainly it was in response to the conditions that were out there. Obviously, the prison officials who were supremely self-interested were trying to say, well, this is just a way for criminals to recast their image. But the reality is, I mean, like I said, 500 people in Pelican Bay in solitary confinement for over 10 years. I mean, the food, the overcrowding, all of these things that took place are extremely devastating. And really, if you look at what was happening in this prison hunger strike, prisoners uniting across racial, ethnic, religious lines, something that's almost unprecedented in American prisons. It's something that has to be driven by the self-interest of them to improve their own condition. Unfortunately, many of these things have not been changed because of the brutal response of prison authorities. The hunger strike had to take a quick step back, but I know prisoners are continuing to organize and continue to fight for their rights.
Absolutely. And one of the other grievances that came up through these multiple lawsuits is that the correction system is incredibly expensive. Can you talk about some of the resources that are really being poured into this complex system?
Of course, there's hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars that are being poured into this system on a daily basis. And it's not to educate people or to give them job training, but simply just to build these prisons, to hold them in there, and to find different ways to control people even further. And that's at the same time that we're seeing funding towards things like education going down and so on and so forth. And in many states, and really we see that more money is spent on prison than is spent on higher education and other things of that nature. So it's a tremendous drain in resources, and really even from the human level to the financial level, and it's something that is taking a huge toll on our country.
Well, Eugene, there's a lot of ground to cover on this issue. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but everyone should definitely check out your book, which is called Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.